I remember the night as if it happened yesterday. The lights of the restaurant shimmered against the glass walls and the sound of soft jazz filled the air. It was one of those evenings where everything seemed too perfect to be real. My husband Mark had insisted on attending this luxury dinner hosted by our company partners. He said it would be good for appearances and to show unity in front of the board. I had agreed because I always believed in keeping peace in public. But I had no idea that by the end of that dinner, my entire perspective on him and our marriage would change forever. Mark and I had been married for 7 years. He was charming, confident, and used to getting what he wanted. People saw us as the perfect couple, the kind that smiled for photos at charity events and looked powerful together. What most didn't know was that behind those smiles were cracks that had been forming for years. Mark had an ego that fed on control. He liked to remind me that he was the face of the company, the one people admired, the man everyone respected. I had built most of what we had, but he had a talent for taking credit in ways that made it look natural. The dinner was meant to celebrate the closing of a major partnership deal. The restaurant was filled with executives, investors, and a few close friends. Waiters glided between the tables carrying expensive wine and small dishes that looked more like art than food. I wore a black dress that Mark had chosen, elegant but understated. He liked it when I looked polished but not too noticeable. That night, I decided to stay quiet, smile, and play my usual role as the supportive wife. As the evening went on, the conversation turned toward the company's success. One of the investors raised a toast to Mark for his leadership. He smiled, clinked glasses, and thanked everyone for their support. Then he looked at me with a smirk and said something that made the entire table laugh except me. He said that the only contribution I had ever made to the company was choosing the color of the office walls. The words hung in the air like smoke. The laughter echoed around the table, and I felt my chest tighten. I smiled faintly to hide the sting, but inside I felt something sharp twist inside me. He went on to make another joke about how I probably did not even understand half of the business meetings but liked to tag along for the free dinners. More laughter followed. Every chuckle felt like a slap. He looked at me proudly, as if humiliating me made him more of a man. I stayed quiet. Years of experience had taught me not to react in public. But my mind was racing. He had just mocked me in front of the very people who knew how much work I had done behind the scenes. When the dinner ended, he placed his hand on my back and whispered that I should not take jokes so seriously. That was how he always dismissed his cruelty. It was never his fault. I stayed silent on the drive home. But silence was no longer peace. It was preparation. That night, when he fell asleep, I stood by the window and watched the city lights. I had built that company from the ground up. It started with a small marketing idea I developed during my university days. I had the vision, the early investors, and even the first product designs. But when I met Mark, he was ambitious and persuasive. He convinced me to make him a co-founder because he had the charisma to attract big investors. Slowly, his name began to overshadow mine. I let it happen because I thought we were a team. But now, I realized we were not a team at all. He was a man who enjoyed taking credit and mocking the woman who made his success possible. I knew something he had forgotten. I owned 56% of the company. It was my decision that had kept him as CEO. He had forgotten that all the power he flaunted came from the shares I allowed him to manage. The next morning, I called my lawyer and began a quiet process that would take weeks to execute. I told no one. I kept playing my part perfectly. I attended meetings with my usual calm smile. I supported Mark's public events. At home, I listened to his endless bragging. Every time he told me that I should be grateful to have him, I smiled and thought about what was coming. Behind the scenes, I started reviewing company documents, financial records, and contracts. I noticed something interesting. Mark had been authorizing certain expenditures that were not company-related. Luxury trips, personal purchases, even gifts to people who had no business connection with us. He had become reckless, using company money to fund his image. That gave me exactly what I needed. I compiled the evidence and shared it with the board members privately. At first, they were shocked. Most of them liked Mark, but they were not loyal to him. They were loyal to profit. When they saw that his actions could threaten the company's reputation, they turned cold. I called for a confidential meeting with the top investors and partners. It was scheduled to happen 3 weeks after that dinner. During those 3 weeks, I kept pretending everything was normal. Mark was too arrogant to suspect anything. He continued to treat me like someone beneath him. One evening, he even told a friend over dinner that he sometimes felt sorry for me because I would not survive a day in business without him. I just smiled and poured him another glass of wine. When the day of the meeting came, I wore a white suit and tied my hair neatly. I remember looking at myself in the mirror and thinking how calm I felt. Revenge, I realized, was not always about anger. Sometimes it was about balance. About reminding someone who you are. The boardroom was filled with familiar faces. Mark walked in confidently, shaking hands and greeting everyone like the star of the show. He took his usual seat at the head of the table and began talking about his plans for the next quarter. I let him speak for 10 minutes before I interrupted. I told him that before we discussed future plans, there was something urgent we needed to address. He looked at me, surprised but slightly amused. He was used to me being quiet during meetings. I opened the folder in front of me and began reading through the financial discrepancies. The room grew silent as I listed the unauthorized expenses, complete with dates and amounts. I then handed out printed copies of the evidence to every board member. Mark's smile faded slowly as he realized what was happening. He tried to interrupt, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but I kept going. When I finished, I looked him straight in the eye and said that as majority shareholder, I was calling for an immediate vote to remove him as CEO. The shock in the room was heavy. Mark looked at me like he didn't recognize the person sitting across from him. He started arguing, raising his voice, accusing me of betrayal. But the board had already seen the evidence. When the vote was taken, every hand except his went up in favor of his removal. He stood up, furious, and demanded to know who gave me the right to do this. That was when I finally said it out loud. I reminded him that I owned 56% of the company. I had always been the majority owner. The silence that followed was almost peaceful. He stared at me, his face pale. I told him he should have remembered who built the foundation he was standing on before mocking me in front of others. After the meeting, he tried to plead, saying he could fix everything, that we could still work as partners. But it was too late. I had already made arrangements to have him removed from all company accounts and privileges. Security escorted him out that same afternoon. I wish I could say that I felt triumphant, but what I really felt was clarity. He had spent years making me feel small in public and invisible in private. That day, I remembered who I was. I was not his accessory. I was the reason the company existed. And now, it was mine again. In the following months, the company flourished. Without Mark's reckless spending and arrogance, the environment improved. Employees felt heard, ideas flowed, and our profits climbed. Investors praised the new leadership. Some even admitted privately that they always knew I was the real strength behind the business. Mark tried to rebuild his image by starting another venture, but without my support and reputation behind him, it never took off. I heard he moved to another city eventually, trying to start over. I did not feel hatred toward him anymore, only a quiet sense of justice. 1 year later, I attended another luxury dinner at the same restaurant where it had all begun. This time, I was the one being celebrated. The company had just won an international award for innovation. As I stood there with a glass in my hand, someone asked me how I managed to turn things around so quickly. I smiled and said that sometimes, strength looks like silence until the right moment. That night, when I walked out of the restaurant, the city lights looked different. Brighter. For years, I had been living in the shadow of a man who believed he was the sun. But once he was gone, I realized I had always been the light. The truth is, revenge is not always about destroying someone. Sometimes, it is about reminding them who they underestimated. It is about taking back what was always yours and doing it so gracefully that they cannot even hate you for it. People often ask me if I ever loved Mark. I did. But love without respect becomes a cage. He built that cage for me with his pride, and I broke it quietly, without raising my voice. The dinner that night was not just a meal. It was the spark that reignited my strength. When I think back now, I do not remember the laughter that stung or the embarrassment that burned my face. I remember the moment I decided to stop being silent. I remember standing by that window, watching the city, and realizing that I did not need to be saved. I just needed to remember who I was. Life has a way of giving us mirrors in unexpected places. That dinner was mine. It showed me everything I needed to see about him and about myself. And in the end, it taught me that the most powerful kind of revenge is not loud or cruel. It is quiet, intelligent, and final. So if you ever find yourself being mocked, underestimated, or made to feel small by someone who claims to love you, remember this. Power is not about who speaks the loudest in the room. It is about who owns the table they are speaking at. That night, my husband mocked me at a luxury dinner. He forgot one small detail. I owned 56% of the company. And when the time came, I reminded him of it in the only way that mattered. He walked out thinking he was in control. I stayed behind knowing that I always had been.